My name is Debbie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am really, really thankful for, do I call you Dr. Beth and Dr. Melissa? It's weird when you're no longer a student. It's just like, those lovely educators in the back for bringing me in, and especially to kind of talk about it in the context of my experience as a Black queer person and Black queer woman. What I have done here and learned here at Carleton, how I like to plainly call it shit disturbing, and taking all of those experiences, trying to shift culture and policy here at this institution, and what it's given me now in my role as an executive director of a national organization, where we're at the forefront of government relations and lobbying for queer and trans people across the country and around the world, especially at a time where we're seeing some of the most insidious backlash to our communities, especially for those who are further marginalized because of their race and disability and other positionalities. I'm gonna tell you what I studied. I started at Carleton in 2010, back in when people still used Facebook regularly, and I finished my entire time here in 2018. So I finished graduate school 2018, crossed the floor 2019, and that was the last in-person graduation until the most recent one in the kind of post-pandemic, and I'm putting that in quotes, era. I did my undergrad in women and gender studies with a double minor in political science and African studies. And then, instead of leaving this school, I decided I'm going to stay another two and a half years. Why not? And I did my master's degree at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, where I majored in international development policy. So policy is the name of the game, but with the undergrad that I have, very much so that's social justice, human rights focused work. And as someone who has roots in Ghana, I've always been passionate about Canada's international development policy, and that being informed by people who have connections to the global south. And so my parents moved to Canada in the mid-'80s, and I was born here. I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, and I have been in Ottawa ever since. It's the city that has grown on me. I love it now, but it has informed much of my experience in activism and policy, where I've gotten to meet really cool people, including folks like Dylan Black. So my master's research, I wanted to give you the name of it because I found it was kind of silly. Because policy, especially international policy, people have this idea that it's really scary and neoliberal. And in many cases in the program here it is. But I wanted to make it as personal as possible. And so my research topic was entitled, I Need Money for the House Back Home, Divorce and Migrant Women Investments in Homes for Retirement in Ghana. So I actually got to spend time talking to Ghanaian aunties about their experience going through divorce here in Canada, and whether or not it changed their investment in remittances and building homes back home. Because I always like to talk about grassroots development and the fact that even though we've moved to Canada and we've been here, we've been investing in our communities transnationally, which is really awesome. I always like to tell people that student activism made me the Black feminist I am today. I will always say that my post-secondary education experience and the things that I did here have informed who I've become. They've given me the skills and the analysis to do the feminist work I currently do. So I know, as a result of my time here at Carleton, what it's like to lobby government, especially because I got to do lobby days within my time as a student activist. I got to create and implement projects here when I worked at the Women's Center, which I believe has a new name now. I got to learn about building relationships, and I also got to learn what it's like to speak truth to power. And I get to do all of this now, of course, as an executive director of a national LGBTQ organization, but also as a community member. One thing that's not in my introduction is that I'm one of the commissioners for the Ottawa People's Commission on the trucker convoy occupation. So if you were here in February 2022, and if you lived in the downtown area, you would know very intimately what that experience was for 3 weeks. I live in the Vanier area, and so a little off of the downtown red zone area. However, an area that was often ignored during the occupation as the headquarters or the staging area for the folks who were occupying was right in my neighborhood. So when it comes to municipal engagement and municipal policy, I'm very much engaged. And if you follow me on Twitter, I was a very loud gal when it came to the last municipal election, and have been fortunate enough to provide some policy advice for now former councillor Catherine McKenney on LGBTQ issues, which I think is a really awesome opportunity. Another thing about my time here at Carleton, I was a student athlete. So I played 4 years of varsity rugby while I was here. And I'll actually never forget the times in which I was given the thumbs up from my coach. He actually told me, please do this. I would take our team to take back the night marches so that there was a presence of young women who are in a sport that often is viewed as very empowering because of our ability to do contact. And I got to do that while working at a student center, and I actually have memories of myself when I had hip surgery because of a gym injury, wheeling myself to the women's center and then going to rugby games. But it was really cool again to even bring that activism into my student athlete work. And then I ended up working at the undergraduate student center, at the women's center where I mentioned. And then, because it never ends, I decided to run for the Graduate Student Association. I was encouraged, and then I was like, okay, while I was still an undergrad, and I was the president of the Graduate Student Association in 2016. So it was through that experience where I got to kind of meet some really cool professors who remain some of my role models from afar. Shout out to you. And I got to do even cooler things where it came to kind of holding power accountable here on campus. So during that time, so in my first year I was president, my first year of grad school, second year I was VP operations, because although being president was cool, I was tired. So it's come second year, I was like, I'm gonna need to take a step back. But I was doing all of this while still being involved in Black feminist things, gender-based violence advocacy, feminist campaigns, as well as advocating for graduate student mental health. And so not to say that undergraduate student mental health issues aren't the same, but they're a little bit different as your time as a grad student kind of shifts from being primarily a student to student worker, to someone who's probably in the field because you're literally working the same time you're in school, which everyone is, but you're also sometimes teaching students at the same time. I think what was really clear for me during my time at Carleton, and very much so still now as someone who's still in the community, is that our post-secondary institutions indeed mirror the oppression we see in the world. It doesn't stop once you cross Bronson. All of the racist, homophobic, sexist, misogynist things still exist within these institutions. And at my time, and we're talking about the early 2010s, and not much has changed, even the language around culture wars, where universities were a site where people felt like what we were learning through the academy, learning the language of intersectionality, learning the language of critical thought, learning some of the pillars that I believe are foundational to your program in social work. People did not want that to be a thing. They felt that these were bad things for Canadian society. And there were interesting debates that were happening between some of the more progressive students and the Carleton conservatives, who I believe are still a club here on campus. And it's ironic because so many people would be like, oh, aren't universities all these radical spaces? And I'm like, actually, it's probably where I saw the most conservatism from administration, and a very interesting experience learning all of this and what it meant, especially as a 19-year-old. Till this day, and correct me if I'm wrong, the administration remains very white, very male. and extremely overpaid based on like collecting your tuition fees. And that's where I believe we have to continue lobbying and fighting when it comes to like where your funding is or your tuition is going. I remember the president, who we had a lot of fun engaging with in combative ways, made, I think, $500,000 a year off of student tuition. She's no longer here, and best believe many of the people I went to undergrad with celebrated that, but it just kind of painted the power dynamic between students who are investing in their education, whose salaries we were paying, and the decisions that they were making that were impacting us. So we were literally invested in making sure that what they were doing and their decisions were for the best of us, but many times that didn't show up. One of the things that I remember us fighting for around service provision very early in my undergrad was around a student-run sexual assault support center. There were many instances of students being or undergoing through, and sorry, trigger warning, situations of violence happening on campus, and students wanted to take back control around how the university would be using the resources that we invest in to make sure the services actually spoke to our needs. We were successful, and I'm talking about the folks who were in school 5 years before I started, who are now almost 40, when you think about like the time difference. They got to see that win eventually, but if I am correct, and this happened while I think end of my undergrad, beginning of graduate school, it went from being student-run to an admin-run thing. So like the very essence of the win that we were able to celebrate quickly shifted because those students left, and like the momentum around making it still student-led and student-focused shifted, unfortunately. One thing I learned really quickly too, engaging with administration and university institutions, and Carleton's not the only one, is that they really care about public relations and maintaining a good PR no matter the cost of it. So some of you may have seen over the years situations like Queen's University having racist themed parties, or the situation at University of Ottawa around professors debating whether or not they could use the N-word. The result of all of this and the student activism that I've been involved in is that there is a purpose that administration has in squashing student dissent, because whenever students rise up, that's a PR issue. So they would try very, very hard to make sure that that was shut down. I myself was involved in, of course, the university's abysmal approach towards gender-based violence. We also were very instrumental in working with faculty and different unions on campus around, at the time, what was a provincially mandated sexual violence policy, where we wanted it to be survivor-centric. The university had different thoughts about that. The risk in doing all of this, especially for myself at the time, was that for Black women to be either at the forefront of this or engaging other Black communities, whether they were domestic students or international, was that we were putting ourselves at risk in being at the forefront. But it was through those Black feminists, especially the ones who, when I started, that I learned from, that I was like, I could be you. I learned to be better activists through them. And for me, wanting to model that for future generations of Black students was something that was really important to me. And so this always goes back to a principle that I continue to advocate for, and actually our organization, CCGSD, that does have a youth focus. It's one we're really invested in as well, is that spaces like universities or even your educational spaces, I'm even thinking like high school. I remember my first protest in high school was around Halloween, because we went to a uniformed school. They tried to cancel Halloween, and I was like, no. So my first act of civil disobedience at 15 was me showing up to school in a costume and getting kicked out. But that being said, you go to where folks are already organized, and school is where it's at. I don't know, do you folks have like a Bachelor Social Work club, student club? Yeah, spaces like that is where you folks kind of learn these skills that are instrumental not only in you being activists, but also being instrumental in you being a great community member, or being instrumental in you being really good at your practice. These things are awesome, and these are the spaces where you folks are already gathered together, where you can be informing change. Radical thought and practice, in my opinion, is supposed to be done here. You need to learn how best to organize a protest. You need to learn the importance of doing peer support. Learning how to do solidarity work across movements, whether it be social work students showing up in support of international students who are dealing with access to adequate employment, which I know was a huge issue for a long time. And these are solidarity movements that should happen across the country. This is where you can learn about media training. There's a large journalism school here, and trust me, journalism students, if they want a story, they're gonna find you. And this is where you get to learn how to talk to media, and at the same time, your peers in a different program learn how to be better journalists. You also learn how to articulate a message of change and articulating it to a group of people who actually don't care about what you have to say. The amount of times I've had to learn how to position myself in a cause to administration who saw us as just young, bright-eyed students. And you learn that that's a skill, especially now, going into lobby meetings with conservative MPs who probably don't care about LGBTQ issues, but it's through here that I've learned how to frame the message to my audience to get them to buy in and to influence them to make decisions, sometimes make good decisions. And one example, even through my work at CCGSD, was the one on banning conversion therapy. It took talking to conservative MPs, some of the most social conservative, and for the House to be able to work collectively for there to be a unanimous passing of that bill. So you learn here how to articulate that message, and I'm really proud of it. I also give credit to organizations like the Canadian Federation of Students, who I know Carleton Local 1 is still a member of, who actually went further to provide this training and led national campaigns to address gender-based violence and rape culture on campus that I was fortunate enough to help share with students when I was working at the Women's Center as a programming coordinator. And I really, really believe that there is a duty in transferring that knowledge to younger populations. And so when I was in graduate school, not being afraid to engage undergraduate students who were even looking for a space to convene. The amount of times where I'd have to sign off so that they could use the space just to have a meeting. Having undergrad students have access to materials that they didn't have for their own mini orientation weeks, or for them to be able to have their own teach-in sessions like this with new students coming in. I think part of my work in my final years of school, especially in my master's, was doing exactly this, and that was being able to pass on as much knowledge and skills to younger generations so that they could take the reins and continue the good work. Now, and kind of taking everything that I've learned and what am I doing now with the CCGSD, as our resident kind of like policy lady at our organization, I've been really key in bringing our organization more into conversations with other LGBTQ spaces, but other sectors around addressing some of these overlapping issues we're continuing to see that are pushing back against basic rights. As someone who also has a background in the gender-based violence sector and is a feminist, I've been the person to bridge the LGBTQ sector with the gender justice and feminist sector as one of the very few women who is a feminist leading a national LGBTQ organization, let alone a Black woman. So when it came to some of the work on Canada's federal 2S LGBTQ action plan, some of the key things that I brought forward and asked, especially when they were looking to engage the broader population, was what is the level of effort on engaging Black LGBTQ people who either are dealing with a level of homophobia and transphobia from racialized communities and other communities, but then on the flip side, dealing with anti-Black racism within LGBTQ spaces. I was asking the question around the experiences of LGBTQ women, in particular trans women and trans femmes, who to this day deal with a significant amount of marginalization with the rising tide of anti-gender ideology, anti-trans sentiment that is specifically targeting trans women. But if you look at the data, it's causing the most harm to Black and brown trans women who every year during TDOR, that list is primarily Black and brown women from North and South America. Other things that we've been instrumental in doing that I'm extremely proud of, that's kind of tied to the municipal elections not only here in Ottawa, but across the province and in different provinces, was our Vote Local, Vote Queer campaign that at some point had to shift its attention to the rising amount of far-right anti-LGBTQ candidates who are running for school board trustee. Education is a very interesting space for these debates. It's an interesting space for conversation around social change. It's also an interesting space to watch those with regressive ideology also try to get their hands in, because as powerful as we recognize the institution of education for progressive change, they also recognize that. And so their effort to reverse that is equally as important for their end. And so we saw that more and more people who held very problematic views on not wanting to see things like intersectionality be taught to young people, and that is literally a course that we teach to schools across the country. People who did not want to see Gender and Sexuality 101 be taught, people who felt like policies that were supporting trans youth, and these are policies from the school boards, so not necessarily what's happening in the curriculum in the classroom, but policies. They wanted to reverse that, even though the Ontario Human Rights Code says you can't. We felt it was important to name that because oftentimes municipal elections, let alone school board elections, are ever cared about. A lot of people were thinking about the mayoral races in Ottawa and Toronto, and we had to bring attention to what was a scary trend, which we could point to the connections in the United States, because American organizations were training these like anti-everything bigots to run for school boards, which is an interesting thing considering the conversation we're having now around like foreign interference in elections. We need to talk about what does it look like for America, who is our largest trading partner, also playing a role in trying to influence elections, because they recognize if these folks start in school boards, they'll move up to municipal elections, they'll move up to probably provincial or federal. And so we had to squash that. And part of squashing that meant that we worked with students who were in high school to do the name and shame game, where we worked with them to endorse certain candidates who had views that were favorable towards equity and naming those who didn't. And that became such an interesting practice where I remember being at the gym trying to work out, and I had like 3 different people being like, Debbie, I'm going to go vote today. Who should I vote for? I don't know who my school board trustees are. I don't know which one's the one I got to avoid. And like actually having to take the time to sit people down, to send them the links to organizations that were actually showcasing candidates and the endorsed candidates. And as a result of this, not only here in Ottawa, but also in other communities across the country, we actually prevented all of the like TERF, if folks don't know the term, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, from being elected. And one of my friends, who is a co-organizer of mine, we used to organize Ottawa Dyke March together, Lyra Evans, was reelected. And she's an openly trans woman who is now the chair of the OCDSB. So shout out to her. And on the West Coast, we have the first ever openly trans man elected who unseated one of the biggest bigots out in British Columbia, who actually has a Supreme Court case that my organization's an intervener on, because he is trying to put an anti-slap case on someone who said, you are a bigot and you shouldn't be a school board trustee. So defamation. So he was trying to say, you're defaming me, even though it's on record of him having harmful views against trans youth. And it's now at the Supreme Court, which means that at some point there may be legislation across the country, if we're successful, around school board's responsibility and school board trustee responsibility to not cause harm to queer and trans students. So there was a lot there, but I am extremely proud to be a Carleton alumni, and I'm extremely proud of what I learned here in the 8 years that I was at Carleton. And I always tell people to take advantage of learning these new skills, the opportunity for your faculty to bring in folks like me who work from home and need an excuse to leave their home offices to talk to folks. But then also to remind you folks that you folks can do awesome work while you're here, and you'll be completely surprised what you learn here will bring you as you continue on with your careers. That is a big result of, like, again, that like solidarity across movements. And so some people would be like, what would a national LGBTQ organization want to do with a municipal grassroots group? It's like, it's all connected. Actually, the work with Horizon from CCGSD started because trans exclusionary radical feminists were doing a postering campaign downtown with some of the most vile messaging. And the thing about their messaging, if you're my mother, who is a 60-something-year-old Ghanaian woman who reads English, plain language, you can see what they write and be like, oh yeah, that's not harmful. But if you're a trans person who's seen the dog whistles, you know exactly what that language is. And one of the first things we did was try to bring this to City Hall, and we did this collectively with Horizon, Activa, Kindspace, Wisdom to Action, to say, as a municipality where these posters are being used on your poles, which are by law enforced, you have a responsibility to ensure that our communities are safe to trans folks. By the way, trans activists, including one of my friends, Maëlys, have been tracking the instances of like transphobic occurrences in Ottawa. This is all connected. This is a municipal issue. At the time, the mayor, I won't say his name, who happens to also be queer, but not like political queer, more like, you know, anyway, didn't care at all. And so we decided to keep continuing the fight and bringing that municipal piece to some of our provincial engagement and the federal engagement. But yes, Horizon Ottawa was instrumental in disseminating kind of the graphics of the endorsements and was instrumental in us getting that media attention. It went to CBC. And I think if it didn't go to CBC National, because usually queer issues are never seen as like worth discussing federally, it brought attention to middle class suburban moms to be like, I don't want bigots elected. Who should I know? And they were coming to us to ask those questions, which I thought was really incredible. And I like to think that I'm the perfect like role model for this. I'm not, but I'm also a big advocate on self-preservation. I don't know if you folks have engaged with Audre Lorde's work, but she has a very beautiful quote that says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that itself is an act of political warfare. And that inspired, it's funny, it inspired a workshop or a series of like graphic design I did for Mushu, which is a business here in Ottawa, which is awesome. So again, I get to do activist work with businesses that are rad, which is cool. Rad businesses. I would never do it for like Rogers Canada or anything. But the whole purpose was to like tell the message or push back at the message that self-care is supposed to just be things that you buy, because capitalism likes to seep itself in everything that we do, including taking care of ourselves. So all this to say, I try to be guided by that principle. And that principle reminds me that for Black women in particular, we are often told to show up for everyone and everything at our own expense. And it goes back to a history of like extracting everything from Black people and Black bodies for the sake of other people's benefits. And so honestly, to practice that like radical self-care, I've been trying my best to do the art of nothing. And I mean, like, I'm serious about nothing. And becoming an executive director at 28 during a pandemic meant that my days, like my work time blurred into my personal life, and my personal hobbies and interests are so directly connected to my work that it felt hard to like, what was the beginning or the end of my work time and my hobby time. And so really just starting to practice to do like nothing. So like just shutting off my brain, watching Netflix is one example. But the other thing, because it's really hard for me not to be productive, is I make earrings, but not just any earrings. I make what the internet likes to call lesbian earrings, which are made of like miniature things. And so I have like over 300 pairs of earrings. I think it's bad, I know. But I've made probably 2/3 of them. And it's literally just me playing with toys. So I get miniature toys and I make them into earrings, and I'm not wearing them today. I was like, I'm gonna look professional today. Still stylish in my colors, but not with anything funky. But I'm trying to think what I wore recently. I had like literally a set of trains and a matching necklace I wore to like a progressive conference recently. And I just like it because it allows me to also like play at the same time, which I think is really fun. So it's self-preservation, it's fun, but I'm also practicing doing nothing, which I think is really important. That's another thing too. I do not like sacrificing like who I am for the sake of this work. And so the next time you see me, you'll probably also see me in a color coordinated outfit that is very bright and loud. And I also try to bring that in professional spaces. So like I will be in like a polka dot blazer with like bright pink shoes with my septum ring. And I'm also cognizant as a dark-skinned Black woman who's also been taught that respectability and even from my parents, and I understand why from a survival standpoint, but also trying to like take up space of my own accord. To be like, yeah, you're also going to hear what I have to say and enjoy my outfit at the same time, which is kind of cool. So yeah, I agree, not having to sacrifice who you are doing this work, which I think is also a really important message for people to take. I was born in Canada, but I also say I think it's political to say that I'm from Ghana at the same time. And I grew up in Brampton, so if anyone's familiar with the GTA, I had to escape Ghanaian people to move here. So like I grew up entrenched in my community with my language, and to be now very out doing the work that I do, I sometimes forget the risk I put myself in, but then I'm also very aware of what it means for queer Ghanaians who have to deal with the consequences of coming from a colonized country where, for us, anti-sodomy laws were introduced by the British in 1860, I believe, and we still have those laws today since our country became independent in 1957. One thing that I do now, because my foot is still in the door when it comes to international advocacy, despite being at CCGSD, I'm on the board of directors of Dignity Network Canada, which is an organization I would encourage you to take a look at. It's a national organization that's membership-based with about 50-something organizations that are either international development that care about LGBTQ issues or domestically national that focus on LGBTQ issues primarily. So my organization's a member, but organizations like Oxfam Canada, where I used to work, is also a member. And the whole purpose is to support and drive Canada's advocacy on global SOGIESC issues. And one of the most rewarding parts of utilizing being an ED of a national org, being on the board, is that when Ghana, the country that is often referred to as like the example of democracy in the continent, especially in West Africa, it is literally our motto is freedom and justice. In August 2021, the opposition party introduced the most far-reaching anti-LGBTQ bill that we've ever seen. And when you look at that bill and you read it, we went from having a colonial law that penalized acts, and the language around it, it's called uncarnal knowledge, which how do you even define that, right? But this bill names every single identity within the 2S or LGBTQ acronym. And not only does it penalize those who identify as it penalizes those who support LGBTQ communities. So this could be my mother. And if you're someone who lives abroad, you would be arrested if they know that you do this activist work. So like we're talking about direct impacts to people like me who haven't been in Ghana in like 30 years. And the scary part is when you look at that bill, very similar to what happened in Uganda, we can draw the connection to American far-right family value think tanks who we know are supporting certain politicians in Ghana to kind of start infiltrating our democracy, ding, 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 through these particular type of social conservative values. So I bring this up to say that it makes it very, very challenging because the work ends up being distracting, as in having to justify that LGBTQ people have always been here. And the best part of this work for me, the most rewarding, has been working with local LGBTQ people. So I've developed some of the amazing friendships and partnerships with LGBTQ activists in my home country, including the ones who had their center shut down by the federal government. That led to, February, they shut down the center, August, introduction of this bill that's still being debated today. And it's, for me, the biggest piece, especially when I'm doing this work here, is reminding them that it's not Western folks who, that's actually one of the principles we have. Queer people in Ghana or the US, or in Canada and the US, are not the ones at the forefront of this. It's actually human rights defenders on the ground. And Canada's responsibility as a foreign entity that also has a history of colonialism and the introduction of the gender binary, it's not to be this altruistic example of we're good at LGBTQ rights, therefore. It's no, cut a check and support these human rights defenders who actually need protection. And so I'm really proud to say that our organization, for the first time ever, is doing our first ever international project with LGBT Rights Ghana and SEDGI in Malawi. And it's the first youth-focused project per this funding from Global Affairs Canada to support human rights defenders in these two countries. And so I get to do that, and I think it's using my leadership and lived experience to help facilitate this partnership. And I've been leading the advocacy on this here in Canada, and to put the money behind the cause is, I'm going to ensure that the folks back home who are doing this work are going to get funded. And it happened. So I'm really proud of myself. So I'm excited that this is happening, and we started in April, and the biggest importance is supporting those who are doing the work on the ground. That was a long ramble, but support the work of the folks who are on the ground. Look like for there to be a social work and political science hybrid. And in women's studies, we had a hybrid between women's studies and business, which I thought was interesting, which was primarily students who identified as women. And it focused on women's leadership. What I wish it really did, if I led the course, I wish it would have went further to talk about challenging liberal feminism and this idea that we just need more girl bosses, and that there's a responsibility, I think, that we have when we're in those spaces, especially around EDI. What would it look like, or what would it look like to even imagine maybe a political science and social work hybrid? What could social workers learn from political science students who are learning about policy and process? And what can those students learn from social workers around the impact policy has on individuals who end up needing to seek the services from social workers, right? A prime example, connecting it to what's happening in Ghana, and this was an aha moment for the activists back home. I had to tell them, because of how diasporas work and how communication flows, the increased rhetoric that's anti-LGBTQ was having a direct impact on queer and trans Ghanaians here. That people were petrified at home. And I had a friend who was a social worker. We actually held a healing space for queer and trans Ghanaians in Canada. And she said, Debbie, it's happening here. And so we had an international town hall, and I said it, we're seeing the impacts of this bill with Ghanaians here. And the person who leads Ratify Ghana was actually bringing this information to embassies that he was talking to, that there's a responsibility from the international community because Ghanaians who live in your countries are impacted. And so, there's that piece, but then also where social work comes in from a data perspective to inform policy and even international policy, which I think is important to consider. So for folks who are unaware of what the Ottawa People's Commission is, it is a community-led, community-driven commission to record their experiences of residents during the occupation in early 2022. A lot of people are like, oh, why are you doing this? They did the Rouleau Commission federally that looked at the use of the Emergency Measures Act. The City of Ottawa Auditor General also did a review. The reason why we're doing it is because, one, the Rouleau Commission federally is only looking at the use of the Emergency Measures Act, and the City of Ottawa's Auditor General is only looking at the city's response. There has not been anything that looked at people's experiences, what residents went through, and this is the community creating that opportunity for folks to be heard to record those experiences in the hopes, and I always like to talk about archiving. I'm artsy-fartsy too, so and history is important to me, so that archiving process, but also using it as a policy tool to drive policy so that this never happens ever again. We released the first report in January, which was what we heard. And the second report, which is heavily on our recommendations, is going to be launched in a week and a half. This evening I have a meeting where we're taking our recommendations and we're consulting with community groups. So for example, the Ottawa Black 613, the Ottawa Black Diaspora Coalition, CPEP, which is I always forget their acronym. They work on criminal prevention, no, not criminal prevention, sorry. Criminal prevention and education. There we go. They're an abolitionist group here, as well as some other groups to like just see if our recommendations are sound with what they experience, because community groups were very instrumental in pointing out the hypocrisy that was everywhere during the occupation. And some of the things that we heard from folks was that their mental health was impacted during this time. And so for folks who work in social work, if you really want to if you really want to talk about that direct impact between what was a policy failure at all three levels of government, and its direct impact on people, it's the ongoing consequences. There's some people who are now like the hearing a horn elicits a feeling in them. There are people who, I like to say, like, so there are like middle-class white people for the first time experienced the failure of policing, which for me, and I talked about this publicly all the time, was like, oh, interesting, because there are community groups who've been talking about this in the city forever. And it's like, thanks for finally like hearing what we've been saying, because we saw the direct response to that, in which now the PR around policing and during the municipal election where we thought the lessons learned would be something we would have seen in results. Ottawa does things Ottawa wants to do. I didn't vote for the mayor, so I'm just gonna say I didn't vote for him. But even that too, around how leadership are what an institution that is heavily funded. What does that mean? How I even provided the gendered analysis on leadership at the municipal level, and the result was that there was a particular gender difference on who responded to community. And because Catherine McKenney is no longer a councillor, they were able to give us all the tea, because there's a clear difference between what we've heard from people when we asked which leaders showed up across the board. People in the downtown area were like, there was one councillor. There was maybe one MPP. I don't know where the MP was. I'll leave that, whatever. I don't know where he was, but there were two people, but people made it very clear to mention Catherine, who put their own life at risk as a trans person to walk people home, people who needed to go to and from the different areas in the red zone. So that was something that I think is really key and often was missing in any analysis, is that it's like we need to really consider the culture of leadership, which was, and there's a video of me from our press conference back in January talking about that, because a journalist asked a really good question. And I said, we need to talk about the culture of leadership. We have a mayor who has a personal vendetta against certain community leaders, and that personal vendetta got in the way of him and his office collaborating with communities who were being directly impacted. That occupation would not have been 3 weeks had that collaboration happened. There's also things that we feel kind of like vindicated on, like we feel like, oh, okay, because the Rouleau Commission from the Supreme Court Justice said things that we've been saying, and this happened after we released ours, so we were like, oh, look, so the community actually was right in what they experienced. That, I think, is the most beautiful thing about the Ottawa People's Commission, is this process is giving people the opportunity to be like, I'm actually heard, and what I've been saying is actually true, because the level of gaslighting, again, from all levels of the government, was probably some of the most disheartening thing that people had to go through and experience. And now we act like, oh yeah, everything's back to normal. Which is a problem considering everything else around the convoy and the foundation of it hasn't gone anywhere. And so, yeah. We saw again, people not talking to each other, different levels of government not talking to each other. So some people, not to be a political science girly, is it federalism that failed, or is it these individuals? I believe, from my analysis, we had different levels of government and people wanting to place blame on other folks. I actually think the reason why the premier did nothing is because he knew it was politically beneficial for him to make the prime minister look bad. And the only reason he responded is because business was being impacted, and he was like, I guess I got to do something here. Also, too, we have to talk about the fact that there were people who were sympathetic to the cause of the convoy within our policing system at all levels of government, or all levels. And so, what does that mean? And so, from an accountability standpoint, it's not in there, but I actually have a recommendation on that. That if we know that information was being provided from our institution to those who were occupying the city, and we're talking about, certain institutions and people's faith in them. So yeah, we should probably do something about that. I also think on the accountability side, and this is democracy again, that I think for a lot of these folks are like, if people want to hold us accountable, they would vote us out of power. And guess what we did? We handed Doug Ford another premiership for 4 years. And then we also picked Jim Watson's selection for mayor as our mayor. So when we talk about what we have control in terms of accountability. So I didn't vote for them either. So there's I think a political education piece that grassroots organizations like Horizon that were mentioned have been taking the lead on. And I think it means that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, especially in Ottawa, around this. Because if we can be making decisions for better leadership, and we have better leadership, we had a choice. What is preventing us from actually making the move to have that choice for leadership? What is going on with how we understand how leadership is supposed to be, and why are we okay with mediocrity? I don't know. I think while that's still happening, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to keep chipping away and pointing to the hypocrisy of a space that democratically elected people are pushing citizens out of engaging in, especially, and I don't often like to be the person to be like, the taxpayers' dollars, but if there's anything I've learned from conservatives that I rock around with, that is a very powerful phrase to use. And if we are paying for not only the people who are democratically elected in those spaces, but for the institution to actually have funding, the institution of policing, we deserve to be in those spaces. And I think the fight to continue to push for that should never stop. And that's why our grassroots movements are so key and critical. But at the same time, the public education piece, which is why I will always give a shout out to Horizon and CPEP, to point out the hypocrisy of what's happening, because there's an opportunity, and I feel like, I don't want to say the opportunity was lost, but when you have people who are white middle-class people who went through the occupation, who have told us, I felt abandoned by our police services, those are the folks that deserve the political education, because they are the group of people the people who are shutting us out, they recognize to be the most powerful, because they need them to buy in order for them to have the power to exist, right? So there's still that political education work that needs to happen. At the same time, we are pushing and continuing to annoy the hell out of these politicians, and I think it shouldn't stop. It is absolutely critical to be shut out of those. It's hypocritical to be shut out of those spaces, but critical that we fight and punch our way up to get into them. I think I was brought in like phase 2 of this whole process. Phase 1, and this is where a good time to talk about intergenerational connections. It was older, like hippie activists who happened to have lived downtown, who have resources, who were like, we're pissed. We need to do something about it. And I'm not joking. Like, we're talking seniors who, when they were our age, guess what they were doing? And now they're retired, they had time, and they came together and they said, we need something similar to other commissions we've seen when injustices have happened. And they really felt it was crucial to have a human rights framework to guide this. And so I'm really happy with some really phenomenal human rights lawyers that are co-commissioners of mine. But it was them who came together and said, we'll put in this amount of money to do so. Let's see what others have to say. And I got a call from Robert Fox, who was the former executive director of Oxfam Canada, another senior who I guarantee you was probably a hippie in the 70s doing awesome work on many causes, who said, Debbie, your leadership during the Convoy Occupation, your name came up. Are you interested in this? And I sat there and I was like, you guys are really going to do this thing? And they're like, yeah. And fast forward a year, and we've gone from an interesting group of people brought together. There's also an older Black woman who's involved, it's been awesome to like tag team media interviews with her. We've gone from that till now where CBC was asking us to comment on the Rouleau Commission, where our report is being used in different political spaces, where I guarantee you probably in law classes it's come up. And I say that because of Anishnaabe, who is a lawyer and the former ED of Amnesty International Canada. But it started with older, progressive folks who have resources who said an injustice happened and no one has centered the experiences of residents. And the second phase was the invitation to participate and then building the framework to do it and getting it started. And so, yeah, that's how it started, which is incredible. Solidarity work, I think, is really key, because when you do work with allies together, it's mobilizing what you do have. And one of the most incredible resources doing this work that you do have is people power. That's a huge resource. And so when you have people who are mobilized, that is the resource. You have people who are engaged, you have people who are willing to invest their time and their labor. We talk about unpaid labor all the time. It is still labor, and it's still a resource that people volunteer. And so I think that's always a critical starting point. And when you're like, hey, maybe we need other resources, that's where it's important to work in collaboration with folks who may not have the people power, but they may be like, hey, we have a bunch of pens and markers. Do you need them? Or, hey, we have megaphones. You folks don't. We can give them to you. That kind of collaboration with folks is critical to get you those resources. And sometimes they start from not having anything, but your people power.